In this video, I'm going to use my placement guide to place my wool shapes onto the wool background. I'm going to discuss needle and thread options, and I'm also going to do a demonstration of the whip stitch. I have already cut out my wool shapes. I did that in the last video using the freezer paper method. So if you want to see that video, you can follow the link to that, and it will also be in the description down below. Here's the placement guide and my wool background. I'm going to pin my shapes to the wool background with these applique pins. These work very well for wool applique because they're short and they have this tapered head. The thread won't catch on it when you're doing your whip stitch. Some people like to use fusible web to attach their shapes and some do not. I'm in the camp of not using fusible. This is most definitely a personal decision that every wool appliquer makes for themselves. Some people love fusible and some do not, and it really is just a personal preference. I'm going to bring my shapes over, and using this placement guide, I'm just going to eyeball it. I'll place the shapes and I'll pin them in place. Just make sure to not get too close to the edge. Leave at least a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch all the way around. Okay, so I have all my shapes just basically pinned down here, and I'm going to start the whip stitch in a moment, but I just want to let you know that this is how they should go, how I want them to go. And then I sometimes will make minor adjustments along the way. And as I'm whip stitching, say this bucket, for instance, I will remove the handles so that I can whip stitch the 3 edges, and then I put this back on. And I'll leave this top part because I have these tucked under. And so these, I'm going to start with the blue bucket, but I'm only going to do the 3 sides. And then I'll work on these stems because they tuck under. And then I'll finish the top bit here. So you're working in stages for sure. And so you will remove the pins and possibly not. So, and this is again just a difference between pinning and using fusible. If you were using fusible, you would get all of these shapes fused down on top of each other, and then just whip stitch again from there. Okay, let's talk about needles. There are so many needles to choose from. Sort of a standard needle for wool applique is the size 24 chenille needle. There are many different brands, but this size needle works well with many different threads. My personal preference is a needle with a large eye. The more time goes by, the bigger I like the eye of the needle. And we'll talk more about that when we get to thread. But I would say start with a size 24 chenille needle and then experiment with different needles to find the one that you like the best. But today for the whip stitch, I'm actually going to try this size 4 milliner's needle. And the reason I like this needle is because it's a little bit longer than a chenille needle, and I like to have something to hold on to. The eye is not that big on this, but it's bigger than most. So also, I have also seen some people really like to use a straw needle when they're doing the whip stitch. But today I'm going to try this size 4 milliners, and we'll see how this goes. Now thread. Typically with wool applique, a wool thread is used because the wool is fuzzy and the wool thread is also fuzzy, and so it blends in very well. However, if you don't have wool thread, you can also use just 1 strand of embroidery floss. And you can also use regular cotton sewing thread or a size 12 pearl cotton. The main thing is to use a color that is the best match. And if you don't have something exact, then just use a slightly lighter color. I'm going to thread up my needle. Like needles themselves, there are many different tips and tricks for threading your needle.
You can find tons of tutorials online, and maybe you already have a favorite method. For me, I usually take the path of least resistance and use a needle threader. My needle is threaded, and I'll just put a little tiny knot in the bottom. And then when I do the whip stitch, I like to work out ahead of myself. Some people like to work on the side, and some people like to work in front of them, and that's my preferred method. So I'm just going to turn this around, because the first thing I'm going to whip stitch into place is the bucket. It's a little, this is pretty much my foundation here. I'm going to remove the little handle and set it to the side. And I'll just begin up here. And I don't want to start along here because, again, I'm going to have to come in and whip stitch down these stems. So I'm just going to start over here. And the way that I like to whip stitch, I'm going to start right close to the edge. I'm bringing my needle into the wool applique, less than 1/8 of an inch. And then I pull my thread to the front of my work. And then the whip stitch is, I'm going to bring the thread, I'm going to bring my needle back down, not on the applique shape, but right next to it, a slight bit underneath. And then I'm going to come forward about 1/8 of an inch and pull that through. And then again, you'll have to play with your tension, adjust your tension. If you pull too tight, you're going to get these little indents here. And if you leave it too loose, then that's not going to be right either. But again, I'm just going to come right back down just a slight bit under my shape, come up again 1/4 inch ahead, and then pull. And so you can see that this wool thread is blending in beautifully to my wool blue bucket. And as I take a few stitches here and experimenting with this little bit longer needle, I have to say I like it quite a bit. It just feels like there's something to hold on to with this needle, and that it just feels a lot easier for me to work with than the chenille needle for whip stitching. So I'm not going to bore you with going around the whole thing, but I'll check in periodically so that you can see how I'm progressing. And just experiment with pulling these stitches really tight, 1 or 2. You want this thread to be sinking into the wool. So if it's too loose, it sits right on top. And I think a couple of these might be too loose. And if it's too tight, it starts to make the indents. So it's really just a question of going around practicing with your tension and getting the hang of it.